Hey everyone, welcome to Tony D's Media Podcast. And today we're going to talk about comic books. And been wanting to talk about what's been going on in comic books for a while, to give you some of my perspective on it, being a comic book guy, having many years in the comic book industry. Say hello, Joan. Hello, Joan. So, if you look at what's happening to comic books now, and this isn't all of it, but I think this is some of it. I think the idea of feminizing comics as a medium has sort of been the thrust of a lot of the big corporate comic book companies recently. And the reason I say that is because of the subject matter that they tend to tackle. It's not just that they're changing the characters, although that's a big part of it, but it's this idea that they're going to make the comics appeal to women by talking about things women are interested in the comic, right? And they have canceled a tremendous amount of these comics. They're canceling The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl after 50 issues. Comic sales in general are just going down, down, down. And here's my theory on it. Take it for what it's worth. The comic book medium has always been a male-dominated medium. The stats vary anywhere from about 70 to 90% male. Depends on who you ask, really. But traditionally, it's been mostly a male-dominated audience, with about half the fans over 18 and the rest under 18. And now that isn't to say there wasn't always room in comics for women. There were plenty of women creators. There were plenty of comics that were aimed at women. But a lot of these comics, well, I shouldn't say a lot of them, because there weren't a lot of them. They tended to stick to the very few successful female comics, like Barbie. That was a successful comic at Marvel for a long time. They had licensed the Barbie line, and it was very successful, and a lot of girls read it. Young girls, who it would be aimed at. But the thing is, there is a huge difference in men and women, the way they see the world. And men evolved more visually oriented. We pick our mates based on a lot of visual cues. So men are very visual in that way. Now, that isn't to say women can't be visual too. They are. They tend to see colors a little better, and they have their own visual things that they like. But when women evolved to seek out mates, it wasn't just about how the men looked. It was about how they could be as providers. So men and women just evolved differently. So the comic book medium, I think, tended to appeal to men because it was a very visual medium. And it didn't tend to appeal to women because it was fantasy. And that doesn't necessarily appeal to a lot of women who are more concerned with real relationships and things like that. Now, again, that doesn't mean women don't like stories or entertainment. They do. But, the kinds of stories, because they were visual, they tended to be action-oriented. They didn't focus all that much on their relationships. So one of my favorite all-time comics is the Hulk and the Thing team-up issues, which which is very little dialogue, and a lot of the Hulk and the Thing beating each other up and eating hot dogs and doing crazy things. So, that's not a comic that would appeal to women classically. I mean, if you look at all the heroes, they don't appeal to women on their surface. Now, there are elements of the heroic narrative that kind of do, because heroes save the day and there's security in that, and manliness kind of appeals to women. And also, just in general, it appeals, the stories can appeal to them. It's not to say that women don't like comics, but most women, I think if you surveyed the average woman, they just don't read comics because it's not something they do. Just like it's something most men don't look through fashion catalogs. Some do, a few guys will do it once in a while in their lifetime, just like some women might look at a comic in their lifetime. But the differences between the audience are pretty stark. So we have this idea in the corporate comic world now that we have to bring in these women, and they're pulling out all the stops to try to bring them in, and they're just not really coming. If you look at the comic books in Japan, the audience there is closer to 50-50. But it's a different culture over there. Comics are an everyday thing in everybody's life. They have comics for literally everything in Japan. There are comics for fashion and sports. There are corporate comics. Like, there's a comic for the Honda Corporation that tells the story of Honda. There are tons and tons of porno comics. And when I managed a comic book store, usually the only time I sold porno comics was to women. Those appealed to them. That partly, I think, because not necessarily the sex, although that was part of it, but partly because those are also very relationship driven. The sex was going to happen, but in order to wind it up, there had to be some relationship going on there, right? So, I think if Marvel Comics and DC Comics truly wants to bring in female readership, the first thing they have to do is stop sacrificing the male readership in an attempt to gain the female readership. Like, it doesn't do them any good to turn all their male dominated characters into women, or just drive this it's killing them. It's killing their sales, and with good reason. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's a woman or someone who's diverse. It's comic book fans have always hated change. They've always hated it. So people who read Iron Man want to see Tony Stark. When they replace Tony Stark, inevitably they always come back to him. Same thing with Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, all these characters. They would replace them for a while, and maybe for a while that would be a nice, refreshing change, but ultimately everybody would go, hey, when's the original guy coming back? And they would always gravitate back. And then that would leave, a character like Rhodey in Iron Man. What do we do with him? Oh, well, we'll make him War Machine and try to spin him off in his own comic, which always felt like a, second-rate Iron Man as compared to the original. So that's not what comics really needs. What it really needs is more original characters. Because what gets tiresome about reading, the same old DC and Marvel superheroes is that they never meet anybody new. It's always the same old villains and the same old sidekicks and the same old people running into them. And then, they have to forget about the stories from 5 to 10 years ago because fans don't really remember, and that was so long ago, and the characters are over 50 years old. Nobody can remember all the history now. So, how do you, as a creator writing a story, deal with this ridiculously long history and have these characters not go completely insane in any kind of realistic way. I mean, mentally these characters would all be broken down. So many things have happened. Some of them have done terrible things. I mean, you look at Hal Jordan, how they took the character and made him bad and then tried to make him good and redeem him. You just can't really do that. After a while, you've sort of beaten a dead horse. So the medium absolutely needs these new characters, but by taking Iron Man and saying, well, now Iron Man is this other person, it doesn't matter who the other person is. It could be Tony Stark's son. They still want the original. So, what I think the comic book companies need to do is really sit down and stop trying to take the superhero universe and retool or whatever. It is what it is. Superheroes are for guys. Let it be for guys. Let people create that world and have fist fights and laser blasts and all that cool stuff that's always been popular, and then create a second imprint that would appeal to women. Romance comics, when they were being published, were very popular. And they can be popular again. They're popular in Japan, and they would be popular here if done and aimed specifically at women, specifically at a girl audience. There are plenty of artists out there in the independent comic book community who do these kind of comics. In my travels, I met a woman who did a comic book. It was strictly about knitting. Right, that's what I said. Crazy, right? A comic book about knitting. She would go to knitting conventions and sell this comic, and people loved it. Loved it. She had a fanatical following because she was the only person who did a comic book about knitting. When you do independent comics, you have to try to come up with a new angle. My first comic was The Jersey Devil. It appealed to people in South Jersey who understood the folk tale around here, and they got very excited when they saw the title. I barely had to sell it to them. They'd buy it. So, there are plenty of other things like that, plenty of other niche audiences that aren't being tapped into. And most of, the ones that aren't being fulfilled by women for a women audience, Marvel's ignoring them. DC's ignoring them, essentially. They're just trying to force these female-esque stories on the male audience who don't want them. Most guys who are reading comic books, they want to see Batman beat the hell out of somebody. They don't want to see his relationship with his girlfriend and him having trouble. That's not a story for a guy. That's the kind of thing that they would read a comic book to get away from. Right? I mean, that's kind of a guy thing. That's why we play video games. We like these distractions of fantasy, of like doing stuff, shooting people, and playing games and strategizing, and the idea that you're getting things done. We want that in our entertainment. Women want relationships. They want, one of the things they do in Japan is, besides drawing cars and mopeds and vehicles like with amazing detail, they also draw fashion really well. And that's another thing women like. So if you had a comic book aimed at women, you could definitely appeal to them by having different fashion in the comic book. And they would love that, the different clothes that the characters were wearing. I know creators who have tried to do fashion-related comic books and independently, and they didn't all work out. But there's an audience there that is not being serviced. If I could do it, I can't do it. I'm not a fashion guy, obviously. So, there are. I think Dave Sim actually sort of tried to do it with a short run on a comic book after Cerebus, which I can't think of the name of it. But there is definitely an audience for it if a big company like Marvel or DC would push that line. And you would have to also find your audience not in comic book stores. Women don't go to comic book stores, and you could do all the tricks and bells and whistles in the world. It's not going to change that. I've been to comic book stores like for the last, God, 40 years. And believe me, they're places for guys. They're man caves. They smell. They're full of fast food and magic cards and guys sitting around talking about comics and the Terminator movies, and probably they're all bitching about Game of Thrones right now. That's not necessarily a place that appeals to women. Doesn't mean women can't go there and do the same things those guys do. But those women are rare. Those women are at the end of the bell curve. They're not the average woman. And when you're trying to sell a product, you have to sell it to the average consumer. You have to identify your audience. I think the problem with Marvel and DC and this ridiculous push of ideology is they've lost touch with their audience. By moving Marvel and DC out to LA and becoming part of these big movie companies in California, they've completely lost touch with their audience. They kind of barely had a touch with their audience when they were in New York. New York and LA are two very different kind of places. In LA, when you go to a movie studio lot, it's a compound. It's its own little mini city inside of Los Angeles. Once you don't park outside the movie studio. I parked on the street at a meter outside of, I guess it was Warner Brothers or one of those places, and the guard, as I was walking in, looked at me and said, "Are you gonna park there?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's free, right?" He's like, "Yeah, but I wouldn't leave my car there." And this was the guard who could see my car, at the lot. And I even said to him, "Well, couldn't you do something if somebody like started messing with my car?" And he's like, "What do you expect me to do?" So, it's like a little walled city in a bubble there in those studio lots. And that's where the current talent, the editors who direct all this stuff, exist and work in. They work in this compound that's, it's great inside the studio. There's it's very corporate, but it's also a movie lot, and there's celebrities walking around, and there's great commissary. It's all very nice and green, and people got money. There's no homeless people in there. New York, it was a different story. Yeah, they were on Park Avenue, DC, I think, or Marvel, one of them. And they were in a big skyscraper. And then, I was definitely in the DC offices. I don't remember if I ever went to the Marvel. But, the DC offices just in a skyscraper in an office building. Then you come out, you'd be on the street with everybody else. It wasn't like you were in this compound. So I think that gave the editors and people directing the comics a little more touch, with the average person. And it also wasn't this isolated ideological bubble that Southern California tends to have. And that the gap between poor and rich is much, much more noticeable in Southern California than it is in New York. In New York, you come out of your office building, you can still run into average people who work in the city, but they live in Brooklyn or they live in Jersey suburbs or wherever, and they're just scraping them and getting by. You can go to a bar and run into those people. In LA, it's different. It's pretty expensive. I mean, same thing with cities like San Francisco, and these places tend to be, and it's not universal, but they tend to be more isolated, and they're getting more isolated. And so the mindset of the editors are driving this, and they need to get out of that bubble. They need to either get themselves out of it, or they need to trust talent that doesn't live there, that lives, they need to hire some people in the Midwest to write the damn comics who have a completely different attitude and mindset, because someone out of that area is going to connect more with more people in the United States than the people in Southern California. Because once you get sucked into that, you're in the minority, a very, very, very tiny minority. It's a world where, millionaires, cry about climate change and then get on a private jet and spew God knows how many tons of carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, it's a problem, especially if you're going to address these issues in your comic book stories. So, I would say what we really need, and what I think the comic book industry is driving towards, is we need a collapse at this point. I think what's going to happen, Marvel and DC, and I think it's going to start with Marvel. I think Marvel will eventually be completely shut down. They're just going to pull the plug. It's going to be very abrupt. It's going to all happen when the next phase of the Marvel movies come out, and they'll do okay for a while, but they'll see the writing on the wall. Like the money's going to be going down, and they're going to be, the money guys are going to go, okay, this is not making as much money, and something else is going to make more money, and they're going to start gearing things towards that and getting out of all the promises they made to the fans. And once the money dips below a certain level, they won't care about any promises. They're just going to go, no, pull the plug on all of this. And what typically happens in these movie studios, when they switch, people who are in charge, the new people don't want any of the old movies to succeed. They only want the new movies that they greenlit succeed. So they sabotage the old movies. And when that happens, that's definitely going to be a cue for somebody at Disney to go, well, we don't really need to publish these comic books. We're losing money. We're tightening the belt. So let's license these, close down the division, fire everybody. We'll license the comics to other companies, let them do the comics. They have to pay us the licensing fee. They have to pay us a percentage of the profits, and we get to approve everything. So we have total control. We only make money. It's a win-win for us. Let's do that. That's what they did with the Donald Duck comics and some of the other Disney licensed properties, and that makes good business sense. So that is what I see as the future of Marvel. Will Warner Brothers do the same to DC? Maybe, maybe not. They're always a little behind the curve. If they do it, it's going to be after that. Probably after the direct market completely collapses and every comic book store in the United States closes down. Then DC will go, well, I guess we got to wrap this up. So that's the future I see for comics in the mainstream. Now the other stuff is growing. You look at a lot of the Kickstarter stuff is still going strong, and I think it's going to become more underground again. It's going to web comics like the stuff that I do, even though we're getting killed by the algorithms these days, and a lot of web comics are closing up shop. But we're still in it to win it, and at that point, I think comic fans will change their minds a bit, and it'll all go digital. And, you're going to see a different kind of comic book industry. It's not going to be dominated by superheroes anymore because, nobody wants to publish them. People will be sick of them, and you really need to come up with a new idea that'll really excite people. And eventually, a comic, I'll tell you, Image will probably survive because at least they're trying new things, and, they may morph into some sort of digital entity that still goes as long as those guys keep throwing money at it, and I hope they do. So anyway, that's my big take on the comic book industry as it stands right now. If you want to check out my comics or support me, check out my Patreon. Also check me out at the Webcomic Factory and at superfrat.com. That's it for me and Joan of Arc. We will see you next time.